I know as a judge I'm not supposed to show emotion. And in 22 years, I never have. This is one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life.
It is therefore ordered that you shall be put to death by electrocution. Oh God, have mercy upon me.
Can I please have my mom before I go? It's not my fault.
Please hold
I love you. I love you too. I love you too.
For hell, to be honest, and it's not right.
There are so many people that love Krista, and Krista wants to live for all of us.
Krista Pike has tried on 3 separate occasions on both state and federal levels to get off of death row.
Open to consider that the death sentence was unconstitutional because of her age.
I did something horrible that is unacceptable, and I realize that, but I don't deserve to die for the actions of 3 individuals.
The Tennessee Supreme Court has set an execution date for Krista Pike.
She is going to be killed by the state of Tennessee on September 30th, and when it happens, she will become the first woman executed there in over 200 years, the first since 1819. Stay till the end, because this story is still unfolding right now in real time. She showed it to 3 different people before breakfast was even over. Not hid it, not whispered about it. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out a piece of bone still warm from her own body heat, and held it up like she was showing off jewelry. One classmate thought it was a joke until he saw the blood dried into the treads of her sneakers, and then he believed her. At 8 a.m. on January 13th, 1995, a maintenance worker at the Knoxville Job Corps campus in Tennessee walked into a stretch of wooded land near an old, abandoned pumping station and found what he hoped, was roadkill. He got closer. It wasn't an animal. It was a 19-year-old girl named Colleen Slemmer. Her face had been beaten beyond recognition. Someone had carved a 5-pointed star into her chest with a box cutter. And somewhere, walking around a federal job training campus full of teenagers, was the person who did it. Not hiding, not running, but carrying around a piece of her skull like a trophy. This is the case of Krista Gale Pike, the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States in the modern era. And to understand what happened in that patch of woods, you have to understand what happened to Krista long before she ever picked up a knife. Krista Gale Pike was born on March 10th, 1976, in Beckley, West Virginia. Premature, underweight, and by most accounts, unwanted. Her parents, Emil Glenn Pike and Carissa Hansen, weren't a couple anymore by the time she arrived, and both were struggling with substance abuse, so Krista and her older half-sister were handed off to their paternal grandmother. That home was not a refuge. Her grandmother drank constantly and was verbally abusive from the moment Krista could understand words. The little girl spent her early years playing in and around her grandfather's slaughterhouse, literally growing up surrounded by carcasses and blood as daily routine, while the television inside played hardcore horror films and adult content completely inappropriate for a child. By age 8, relatives already described her as unmanageable. By 9, she was growing marijuana in the backyard garden, unsupervised and unbothered. When Krista was 12, her grandmother died, and she was shipped off to live with her mother, Carissa, a nurse who had neither the means nor, frankly, much interest in raising a traumatized preteen. During this period, one of her mother's boyfriends beat her with a belt, and Krista grabbed a butcher knife and went after him. A fight broken up only because police arrived. Not long after, drowning in the aftermath of ongoing abuse, 12-year-old Krista attempted suicide by overdosing on pills. She got no psychiatric help. None. Her own aunt refused to let Krista's cousins spend time with her, citing the filthy, ruleless house she lived in, but never once tried to intervene or get her actual help. Carissa made half-hearted attempts to bond with her daughter, at one point even smoking marijuana with her, but nothing stuck. Krista lied, stole, and spiraled, and the resentment inside her kept compounding. At 14, when her mother refused to let her boyfriend move in, Krista threatened to run away and live on the street, so Carissa caved. When that collapsed too, Krista moved again, this time to her father's house, where he now had a new partner and another daughter. Glenn didn't take long to notice the same patterns: dishonesty, defiance, manipulation, and he eventually became suspicious that Krista, her 2-year-old half-sister, and threw her out. What none of these adults seemed to register was what Krista had actually been living through underneath all of it. Court records and later psychiatric evaluations would document that she'd been raped on multiple occasions by at least 3 different people, and physically abused by at least 7 family members across her childhood, leaving a network of scars across her back. By the time she earned her GED in 1993, Krista had changed schools 12 times. She was, in the clinical language used decades later by her own defense team, a child who had survived an almost unbearably abusive background and never once received real intervention. Undiagnosed and untreated, she was almost certainly living with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and nobody around her seemed to notice or to care. By 1995, Krista had dropped out of high school and was drifting through North Carolina. Her mother suggested she apply to Job Corps, a federal program still active today, designed to give low-income and at-risk young people vocational training and a shot at stability. Krista enrolled in a computer programming track and relocated to the Job Corps campus in Knoxville, Tennessee, a residential facility where students lived in dorms alongside others who'd washed up from similarly rough backgrounds all over the country. For a while, it looked like it might work. She had a bed, a routine, classes to attend, and then she met a boy. His name was Tadaril Ship. He was 17. The attraction was instant and mutual. Both came from chaotic homes, and both were drawn to the occult and what they described as devotion to Satan. For the first few months, the relationship was, relatively speaking, stable. Then another student arrived on campus, 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer, who had traveled from Orange Park, Florida, because her home state didn't offer the specific training track she wanted. Colleen was, by every surviving account, exactly what she appeared to be: a soft-spoken, kind young woman with a real habit of looking out for others. She'd volunteered with the Special Olympics back home. Her mother, May Martinez, had tried to talk her out of leaving Florida, but Colleen was independent, made the decision herself, and left for Tennessee on October 31st, 1994. It was the last time her family would see her alive. Krista became convinced that this blonde, blue-eyed new arrival was trying to steal Tadaril from her. Colleen denied any interest in him. It didn't matter. The jealousy metastasized fast, and so did the fighting between Krista and Tadaril. Colleen had even complained to her own mother about problems at the center, people going into her room, stealing her jewelry and clothes, and had named Krista, Tadaril, and another student, 18-year-old Shadola Peterson, as the ones responsible. And then, in the middle of one especially furious blow-up, Krista decided Colleen needed to be taught a lesson, and she wanted Tadaril's help delivering it. She brought in Shadola, one of her closest friends on campus, to help pull it off. The 3 of them settled on a location, a remote abandoned pumping mill just off the edge of the university's agricultural campus, isolated enough that no one would hear anything. Tadaril agreed to take part. What they were planning, in their own words, was a human sacrifice. The Thursday before it happened, Krista told a fellow student, Kim Iloilo, that she was in the mood to kill someone that day. He brushed it off as dark humor, with no idea how literally she meant it. That same night, Krista tucked a box cutter and a small butcher's knife into her clothing, then found Colleen and said she wanted to patch things up, inviting her to come smoke marijuana with her, Tadaril and Shadola. Colleen, hopeful for a real truce, said yes. The four left the dorms around 8 p.m. Kim saw them go and assumed they'd simply made peace. The group walked a dark trail toward the woods. Once they reached the old mill, the friendliness disappeared. Krista turned on Colleen and accused her of trying to sleep with Tadaril. Colleen, stunned and frightened, denied it. The more she pleaded her innocence, the angrier Krista became, until Colleen finally asked point blank why they were doing this to her. That question was the trigger. Krista shoved her to the ground, drove a knee into her face, and forced her to strip off her jacket, shirt and bra, then pulled the knife and stabbed her in the stomach. Colleen fought hard enough to nearly break free, but Tadaril grabbed her and began slashing at her chest, ignoring her screams. At one point, desperate, Colleen offered a deal, let her go, and she'd say nothing, disappear to Florida without even stopping for her belongings. They didn't take it. What followed lasted roughly 40 minutes. Krista, Tadaril, and Shadola took turns on Colleen, cutting her, beating her, kicking her in the face, while her screams echoed through the trees. Court documents would later confirm she was stabbed more than 100 times, much of it, according to the medical examiner, while her heart was still beating and pumping blood. At some point, they grew bored of stabbing and flipped her onto her back to carve pentagrams into her chest and forehead, their idea of a mark of devotion to Satan. One detail that came out much later in appeals was that Tadaril himself admitted he cut the symbols into her chest, though at the time the press pinned the entire ritualistic angle almost entirely on Krista. Somehow, after all of that, Colleen was still alive. Krista had already opened her throat, and she was choking on her own blood. So Krista picked up a chunk of broken asphalt and brought it down on her skull, again and again, until she finally stopped moving. Then Krista did something that would define this case forever. She reached down, worked loose a broken fragment of Colleen's skull with her bare hands, and put it in her jacket pocket. A souvenir. The three of them smeared mud over the blood spatter on their clothes, walked back toward campus, and stopped at a gas station to throw out Colleen's ID and gloves. Back at the dorms, Kim noticed Colleen wasn't with the group anymore, but didn't think much of it, until around 11 p.m. when Krista knocked on his door, glowing with excitement, and told him everything, unprompted. At first, he didn't believe her. Then she pulled the piece of skull out of her jacket and showed him. He said nothing, too terrified to speak. The next morning, Krista found another student, Stephanie Wilson, and told her the same story all over again, smiling, looking genuinely proud. Stephanie didn't believe it either, until Krista pointed to the dark stains on her own shoes and said matter-of-factly that it was blood, then pulled the bone back out to prove it. Stephanie, like Kim, chose silence, not wanting to provoke Krista. But over breakfast, she worked up the nerve to ask if Krista still had it on her. Krista said yes, and that she planned to keep showing it off until somebody physically stopped her. That same morning, the maintenance worker found what was left of Colleen in the woods near the mill. Once investigators confirmed the remains belonged to a young woman rather than an animal, the case landed with an officer named Gerald Underwood. He began interviewing students on campus, and by 4 p.m. had walked 3 possible witnesses out to the crime scene to gauge their reactions. 2 stayed silent and shaken. The third, Krista, seemed almost entertained, laughing, unable to stay still. Around her neck, Underwood noticed something that stopped him cold, a pentagram pendant. The next day, the medical examiner confirmed the same symbol had been carved into the victim's chest. Underwood put it together immediately. Investigators pulled the dormitory sign-out logs and found that Tadaril, Krista and Shadola had signed out with Colleen on the night of January 12th, and that Colleen had never signed back in. All 3 were arrested. Searches turned up a satanic Bible and a makeshift altar in Tadaril's room. In Krista's room, police found blood-stained pants and the jacket still holding the piece of Colleen's skull. In her first statement, Krista claimed she'd only meant to scare Colleen, that things had gotten out of hand and the killing was never planned. She even led police to where they'd dumped Colleen's ID and gloves. Nobody believed the premeditation denial. She was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and premeditated torture. The trial opened on March 22, 1996. The medical examiner testified that the majority of Colleen's wounds were inflicted while she was still alive, her heart still circulating blood as the attack continued. The defense brought in expert witnesses to try to explain, if not excuse, what had happened. Dr. Jonathan Pincus, Chief of Neurology at Georgetown University's Medical School, testified that Krista's brain had essentially developed the neurological wiring for violence from an early age, pointing to malformed frontal lobes he attributed to her mother's heavy drinking during pregnancy. On the stand, Carissa flatly denied it. Defense attorneys pushed back by pointing out that Krista's own father had, during her adolescence, signed paperwork to put her up for adoption. Evidence, they argued, that virtually no one in her life had ever truly wanted her. Psychiatrist Dr. William Kenner testified that Krista suffered from bipolar disorder alongside other conduct disorders and traits consistent with borderline personality disorder, and that at the moment of the attack she had essentially lost control of both her impulses and her moral reasoning. Kenner also detailed the extensive abuse Krista said she'd endured, some corroborated by family members, some not. Krista cried in the courtroom as this testimony was read. People who knew her outside the courtroom described someone almost unrecognizable from the girl on trial, soft-spoken, calm, gentle-voiced, hard to reconcile with someone who had planned an ambush, executed it with methodical cruelty, and appeared to genuinely enjoy retelling it afterward. Her aunt, father and mother all testified against her, laying out a lifetime of red flags no one had ever meaningfully addressed. In the end, the jury decided the aggravating factors, the premeditation, the prolonged torture, the mutilation, outweighed any mitigating circumstance, including her documented mental illness and childhood trauma. One line from the sentencing became infamous. They called her a girl with the face of an angel and the heart of a demon. After 2.5 hours of deliberation, on March 30th, 1996, Krista Gale Pike was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by the electric chair, instantly making her the youngest woman on death row in the United States in the modern era, and setting her up to become the first woman executed in Tennessee in over 2 centuries. She sobbed openly as the verdict was read. It didn't change anything. Tadaril Ship was convicted on the same charges, but because he was only 17 at the time of the murder, he wasn't eligible for the same sentence and received life in prison with the possibility of parole. Shadola Peterson took a different path entirely, becoming the state's key cooperating witness, pleading guilty as an accessory after the fact, and receiving 6 years of probation with no additional prison time. Krista was transferred to the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville, where she has now spent close to 30 years awaiting execution. For most of that time, according to her attorneys, she lived in de facto solitary confinement, in a cell roughly the size of a parking space, a condition unique to her because Tennessee doesn't house death-sentenced women together the way it houses men. She didn't keep her head down while she was there either. On August 24, 2001, Krista and another inmate attempted to strangle a fellow prisoner, Patricia Jones, with a shoelace, and in 2004 was convicted of attempted murder, her second conviction. Then, in March 2012, she tried to escape. The plan involved a corrections guard named Justin Etheridge and a man named Damian Chestnut, a personal trainer she'd been corresponding with by letter who had become her romantic partner. Chestnut allegedly paid Etheridge to make a copy of a master key. The plan leaked and both men were arrested. Etheridge cooperated and avoided prison time. Chestnut refused to cooperate and was sentenced to 7 years. The case became a media sensation well beyond Tennessee, profiled on Deadly Women in 2005, later featured on For My Man and Snapped Killer Couples, along with a string of other documentaries. Author Patricia Springer even wrote a full book about it, titled A Love to Die For. Behind every one of those documentaries was a mother who spent the following decades unable to lay her daughter to rest. Colleen's mother, May Martinez, spent years trying to recover the fragment of skull Krista had carried around campus, but the state kept it in evidence since the case legally had to stay open until the sentence was carried out. May has said plainly she believes Krista intended a human sacrifice, and that her daughter was the one chosen for it. She wanted, at minimum, a mold made so she could bury a physical replica alongside Colleen's remains, and kept an urn with Colleen's partial cremated remains mailed to her from Tennessee in her Florida home. As recently as 2023, May was still saying she'd never been able to give her daughter a proper funeral. That same year, Krista filed a federal lawsuit arguing her decades in effective solitary confinement were unconstitutional, pointing out that when then-Governor Phil Bredesen commuted the death sentence of another Tennessee death row inmate back in 2010, it left Krista as the only woman housed under that classification. Her legal team also filed a separate motion arguing her death sentence should be reduced to life, built on a stark argument. Had Krista been 17 instead of 18 at the time of the murder, she would have been constitutionally ineligible for death entirely, the same way Tadaril was. 1 year of age was the difference between her sentence and her co-defendants. Her attorneys walked through her history of suicide attempts and untreated mental illness, pointing out she wasn't treated for bipolar disorder or PTSD until 2002, years into her incarceration, after which her condition reportedly improved significantly with medication. They also leaned on developmental neuroscience, showing the brain isn't fully matured until around age 21. That appeal was denied in October 2023. Krista has said in interviews that while nothing excuses what she did, she takes full responsibility and regrets what happened. May Martinez has said repeatedly and publicly that she wants to see Krista executed. Here's where most retellings of this story end. an appeal denied in 2023, a woman in her late 40s still sitting on death row. But this story didn't stop there, and it is still actively unfolding right now. On September 30th, 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court set a formal execution date for Krista Pike, September 30th, 2026. If it happens, she will become the first woman executed by the state of Tennessee in more than 200 years, since 1819, and the only person executed in Tennessee's modern death penalty era for a crime committed at age 18, 19, or 20. In the year since that date was set, her legal team has fought it from multiple angles. In 2024, attorneys successfully argued she should be moved out of the decades-long solitary confinement she'd been held in, and she's since been adapting to increased levels of socialization, according to her lawyers. This past spring, her team filed a lawsuit challenging Tennessee's lethal injection protocol directly, arguing the state's single-drug pentobarbital method violates her constitutional rights and conflicts with her religious beliefs, since Tennessee law requires condemned inmates to affirmatively choose electrocution if they want to avoid isolation in their final weeks. That challenge led to a multi-day evidentiary hearing that opened on August 11th, 2026, in front of a court-appointed special master reviewing whether the protocol can be constitutionally applied to Krista, given her documented medical conditions and trauma history. Testimony covered her mental health, a blood condition, and the practical difficulties of carrying out the procedure, with findings due to the Tennessee Supreme Court by August 21st. Governor Bill Lee has publicly stated the state's scheduled executions, including Krista's, will proceed as planned, with no changes to protocol. This despite a separate failed execution attempt earlier in 2026 involving a different death row inmate, which officials attributed to difficulty locating a usable vein rather than a flaw in the protocol itself. As of right now, the September 30th, 2026 date is still on the calendar. Advocacy groups opposing her execution have gathered thousands of signatures asking Governor Lee to intervene. Krista has not yet filed for clemency, since Tennessee governors typically don't review clemency requests until after an execution date is already set, which it now is. Her co-defendant, Tadaril Shipp, now in his late 40s, remains in prison in Memphis and is eligible for parole in December 2026, 30 years after a jury decided that being 1 year younger than Krista was the difference between a death sentence and a chance someday to walk free. Whatever you believe about capital punishment, this case forces an uncomfortable question the courts have spent 3 decades circling without ever fully resolving. What do you do with a person whose entire childhood was engineered, almost step by step, to produce exactly this outcome, and who then went on to commit an act of violence so calculated, so prolonged, and so gleefully documented afterward that it's hard to look at through a purely sympathetic lens either? Krista Pike was, by every account, a victim long before she was a killer. She was also unmistakably a killer. The law has never quite figured out how to hold both of those things in one hand, and in a matter of weeks, Tennessee may answer that question in the most permanent way possible. The story that will be discussed here causes deep concern and touches on subjects that unsettle many people: inexplicable actions and situations involving children. This case can be described as one of the most disturbing in the world's criminal chronicles. Louisa van der Merwe was born into difficult circumstances in South Africa, and her life was connected to complicated people from the very beginning. In 1984, when she was 10 years old, she lost her father. She had a warm relationship with him, and despite his occupation, he always found time for his daughter. Shortly after this sad event, Louisa's mother met a new man. Unfortunately, the stepfather turned out to be a person of difficult character. His presence cast a shadow over family life and created constant stress and unease. The years spent living this way did not pass without leaving a mark. Louisa developed a deep sense of insecurity, as the stepfather did everything he could to make the people around him feel inferior. When Louisa came of age, she could no longer bear this treatment and looked for any opportunity to leave the family. So she married hastily, choosing the first man who came along, a man named Freddie. He was 4 years older than her, but to her disappointment, he turned out to be no better than her stepfather. Her husband's behaviour created an oppressive atmosphere that negatively affected the family's relationships. Fortunately, Louisa managed to get out of this difficult relationship thanks to the support of her mother, Carla van der Merwe. After separating from Freddie, Louisa met a mechanic named Christo van der Merwe. He seemed calm, hard-working and affectionate, which caught Louisa's attention. They began dating and soon married. The young family remained living in the same area of South Africa. First, the couple had a boy, whom they named Johan, and 2 years later, on August 9, 2013, a girl was born. They named her Poppy. She was a very beautiful child, with blonde hair and large blue eyes. Everyone who met her noticed her beauty. People called her a little doll and admired her. Unfortunately, Louisa's new marriage did not turn out to be easy either. After the children were born, her husband changed abruptly and began showing aggression. The situation soon became very tense, and the young mother understood that something had to change, since things were unlikely to improve on their own. In 2014, a year after her daughter's birth, she decided to divorce him. According to the woman, Christo, like her previous partner, did not hesitate to resort to verbal insults when it came to venting his frustrations. Shortly before the separation, the situation intensified, and the man's behaviour became so unpredictable that the mother of 2 was forced to seek official protection. After the divorce, Christo was permitted to see the children 3 times a month, but only under the supervision of a social worker. He was also allowed to speak with the children by phone once a week, and most of these calls were recorded. Christo complied with all the regulations and appeared to be a fairly law-abiding citizen. Louisa, however, insisted otherwise, claiming that behind the mask of reliability hid a completely different person. Soon, the young mother of 2 decided to relocate. She ended up 500 kilometers from her old home in the small settlement of Orania. In reality, it was a tiny place with just over 1,000 residents. The settlement was known for its tranquil atmosphere and was considered one of the most prosperous in the region. Descendants of Dutch, German and French immigrants lived there, and the town is notable as a self-governing enclave established for Afrikaner cultural preservation. The protagonist of this story hoped she could finally secure a peaceful life for herself and her children. The small family was warmly welcomed by the Orania community. Locals and members of the Dutch Reformed Church helped the family settle into their new home. Thanks to this community support, the young mother was able to sort out housing and find employment at the local supermarket. Community members also supported the finalization of the divorce proceedings, which were in their final stage. Significant changes then took place in the woman's life. She decided to take in her stepdaughter Marisa, the daughter of her ex-husband from a previous marriage. 14-year-old Marissa wanted to stay with her stepmother and offered to help around the house and with the younger children. With the community's support, the young mother managed to take on the teenager. Marissa truly became an indispensable help. She looked after the children, cooked, and kept the house in order. She integrated so harmoniously into the family that the little ones sometimes called her Mama. Marissa turned out to be calmer than Louisa, which allowed her to manage the children's upbringing better, especially given the mother's workload at her new job. In 2015, a man named Kobus Koikamor moved to Orania. Community members helped him find work at the local supermarket, where he met Louisa. Both had had difficult experiences in previous relationships. Kobus had been divorced twice and had children from each marriage, though he had barely any contact with them. His ex-wives spoke very poorly of him, but Louisa knew nothing of this. Kobus seemed kind and pleasant to her. The romance developed quickly. After a few months, they got engaged, moved in together, and married on November 14, 2015. Astonishingly, the very next day, Kobus sent Marissa back to her father. This came as a great shock to the children, who were deeply attached to their older stepsister. Johan and Poppy suffered greatly from Marissa's absence. In place of the beloved caregiver, a new man appeared who was in no hurry to give them attention. The little ones became difficult and struggled to adjust to the changes. To their disappointment, Kobus turned out to be very different from what they had hoped. Marissa's care had made the children feel needed and loved. She had spent a great deal of time with them and had become a close, comforting figure. The stepfather, on the other hand, proved to be extremely short-tempered and often raised his voice at the children when they cried. During this period, both children were sent to daycare, since the adults worked and could not guarantee care at home. The caregiver there noticed several times how the boy would hide in the bathroom whenever his parents came to pick him up. The children did not want to go home, which raised concern among the staff. Daycare personnel described Kobus as an extremely unpleasant and irritable person who showed coldness toward the children. One of the employees noticed on several occasions strange behavior in the boy when his parents arrived. It seemed as though the child was under the influence of some substance. His reactions were slow, which raised suspicions about the possible use of sedatives. Johan was known for being an unusually active child, and there arose a suspicion that the parents were trying to control his behavior in some way. However, this remained only a suspicion, one that was never confirmed. When the caregiver raised the subject with the parents, they simply laughed in response. After that, no further similar states were observed in the boy. Later, though, new worrying signs appeared, ones that were not given much importance at first. Staff noticed that the boy was often dressed inappropriately for the season. Particularly strange were the jackets and long-sleeved clothing he was brought to daycare in, even on hot days. It was later discovered that this was done intentionally to hide signs of injuries on the child. When staff tried to undress Johan, he would become aggressive and resist their efforts, and so he spent the entire day in his warm clothing. The boy explained that his parents would get very angry if he took his warm clothes off. It was evident the parents were intimidating him to conceal what was happening at home. After daycare staff began asking Louisa and Kobus questions about the family situation, the couple stopped bringing Johan to daycare altogether. Meanwhile, Poppy continued attending regularly. Later, according to legal representatives, the parents also decided to stop sending the younger girl to daycare, presumably because she had been asked questions she could not give clear answers to about what was happening at home. At the daycare, worrying signs had been noticed even before that. Despite her limited language skills, Poppy tried to tell the staff about the incidents happening at home. She showed them strange marks on her body, but the adults could not understand what she was trying to say. Over time, staff noticed unusual bruising on Poppy, appearing in atypical places, for example on her earlobes. New marks would appear faster than old ones could heal. When staff asked Louisa and Cobus about this, they invented a new explanation each time. The parents claimed that both children, Johann and Poppy, were simply very active, and that Poppy supposedly got all these marks from playing or from carelessness. It was difficult to prove otherwise, and staff were forced to accept these stories. Louisa also spoke of supposedly aggressive behaviour from the older brother toward his sister, using this to explain why Johann no longer came to daycare. According to her, they feared the boy might hurt other children and wanted to wait until he was older and his behaviour improved. Staff found this strange, since they had never previously noticed any aggression from Johann. On the contrary, the boy seemed intimidated and withdrawn. A neighbour of the family also began to grow suspicious. He often heard the parents shouting at and scolding the children. He could not testify to any physical violence, but he was convinced that the punishments were not limited to words alone. The neighbour reported one particularly disturbing incident involving Poppy. He once heard the stepfather harshly scolding her, apparently because she had wet the bed. After a few minutes of shouting, Poppy began to cry loudly, and it was clearly not just a cry of hurt feelings. The next day, the neighbour saw Poppy with a cast on her leg. He was struck by the parents' indifference. When Poppy was brought back from the hospital, her mother and stepfather did not even help her out of the vehicle. She was transported in the back of a bakkie, as though she were just any piece of cargo, and got out with difficulty on her own, carrying a backpack that looked heavy for her. Instead of helping, the stepfather only hurried the girl along. The neighbour often noticed Poppy waking up at night and beginning to cry bitterly. He suspected she was tormented by nightmares. Instead of comforting her, the parents, if they reacted at all, only did so by raising their voices and demanding silence. Yet these episodes repeated almost every night. Poppy would try to cry quietly for about half an hour so as not to be heard, but through the thin walls the neighbour could make out her sobs. Eventually she would calm herself and fall back asleep. After the incident with the leg injury, and just as Poppy had barely recovered, a new disturbing incident occurred. The neighbour heard another family conflict, followed by a dull thud. Poppy again broke into tears and was very agitated. The next day, the neighbour noticed a large bruise on her head. In addition, her right arm seemed to move with difficulty, and she kept it constantly pressed against her chest. The man could not bear it any longer and went to see Cobus. He asked the stepfather why Poppy was crying constantly and could barely recover from serious bruises. Cobus only smiled and grew angry, giving no explanation. Instead, the children's mother answered for him. According to Louisa, the new injuries were the result of a fall down the stairs while playing. She claimed that Poppy was very careless and often got herself into such situations, so it was simply a coincidence. The neighbour did not believe her words. He was especially outraged by one episode in winter. At the time, Cobus had been watering the garden. It was quite cold, and the children were sitting on the porch. Suddenly the man began shouting at them and accusing them of some kind of misdeed. This seemed strange to the neighbour, since he had not noticed the brother and sister misbehaving in any way. They had simply been sitting quietly. It seemed the stepfather was only looking for an excuse for an outburst of anger. Finally, the neighbour could not stand it any longer and went to Child Protection Services. Staff at the organisation were supposed to carry out an inspection and prepare a report for the police authorities. Obviously, this should have led to an official complaint, yet no action was taken. Child Protection Services simply ignored the reports about the incidents and the neighbours' statements. The man had to approach the organisation several times before any attention was finally paid to the stepfather's disturbing behaviour. The town was so small it did not even have a full police station, a courthouse or other important facilities. The nearest police station was at least 40 kilometres away, and the neighbour had no way of getting there himself. But he did not give up, and continued reaching out to various local organisations to try to help the children. The attention that social services eventually gave the family situation offered hope that the children's living conditions might improve. In August 2016, a meeting was held with Louisa and Cobus. The parents were ordered to take both children to see a paediatrician weekly, and they were also prescribed regular sessions with a family therapist. At first, the couple followed these instructions and gave the impression of cooperating. In the first month, they attended consultations twice and took the children to the doctor with the same frequency. It seemed the situation was improving. However, it was during precisely this period that the family's neighbour reported the most alarming incidents yet occurring in the home. When he approached social services again with this information, he was assured that the situation was under control and that work was continuing with the family. Yet, for some reason, these measures did not produce the desired result, and the neighbour found himself at a dead end, not knowing how else he could help. The man's statements were confirmed at the next medical examination when signs of injury were discovered on Poppy. When she was asked about their origin, she could not give a clear answer due to her young age. It was only evident that she felt uncomfortable. According to protocol, the doctor should have documented any suspicious signs, but in this case the specialist deviated from the rules. He later explained the absence of any record by saying that 3-year-old Poppy could not explain the origin of the injuries, and that he suspected they were simply common childhood bruises. The doctor accepted the mother's explanation that Poppy had simply fallen while playing, and as a result no further action was taken. One autumn morning in 2016, it was discovered that the family, already known to be troubled, had suddenly vanished. Their departure had taken place during the night, as though they wanted to avoid drawing attention. This caused some concern, and it was notable that Cobus had not resigned from his job, and that the daycare Poppy attended had not been informed of the move. In reality, the couple had decided this was a way to dodge an upcoming medical visit that might have raised unwanted questions. They hoped to disappear by relocating to a new place. Louisa and Cobus headed to the farm belonging to Poppy's biological grandmother, Carla van der Merwe, near Mamogaleskral, outside Brits, several hours away. It was there that the family of Louisa's biological mother lived. It was a rare occurrence for Louisa to visit her mother with the children, since she normally limited the little ones' contact with their grandmother. Louisa's mother, despite her own difficult life experiences, was shocked by the state of her grandchildren. She immediately noticed numerous marks on their bodies. When the grandmother tried to find out from the boy the reason for these marks, he pointed to Cobus. Louisa denied any problems in the family and called Johann a liar. After this encounter, the children's grandmother was seriously troubled by the situation in her daughter's family. Fearing she might cause harm, she decided to go first to a pastor. To her surprise, instead of support, she encountered a negative reaction from the churchman. The pastor expressed the view that the grandmother should not interfere in the affairs of her married daughter, who ought to resolve her own problems herself. After this conversation, Louisa's mother abandoned her attempts to help her grandchildren and did not turn to any other authorities. On October 25, 2016, 1 month after the family had avoided their scheduled medical examinations, Louisa suddenly appeared at the local hospital with her daughter in her arms. The woman reported a sudden deterioration in the girl's condition and asked for help. Doctors immediately began emergency treatment on the child, but it quickly became clear their efforts had come too late. The medical staff were alarmed by Louisa's strange demeanour. She seemed unusually calm for a mother in such a situation, and she mentioned her aversion to dealing with the police. Even more concerning, however, was the state of the child. She presented numerous injuries, and when the mother was asked about their origin, she explained them as the result of being jolted around in the car on the way to the hospital due to the poor condition of the road. This explanation was quickly refuted. The nature of the injuries could not be explained by a single car ride, and their pattern indicated they had occurred at different times, suggesting systematic, inhumane treatment of the child. The doctor also noticed the second child who had arrived with the family. 5-year-old Johann was behaving strangely. He tried to stay away from his parents, avoided eye contact with the adults, and mumbled quietly. When asked about the incident, the boy answered oddly that "Sister doesn't want to eat anymore." Signs of injury could also be seen on him. The entire situation raised serious suspicions and appeared connected to a tragic outcome for the little girl. The doctor therefore decided to contact the police. Louisa and Cobus tried to dissuade him, but he ignored their pleas. When the officer on duty arrived at the clinic, the doctor showed him a picture of Poppy. The policeman, who had recently become a father himself, was so shaken by the sight that he could not contain his emotions. In all his years of service, he had never faced a case like this, especially involving a child who had only just learned to walk. The stepfather was taken immediately to the police station, while Louisa was initially left behind, since it was assumed that, like the children, she too had been living within an unsafe domestic environment the whole time. It will be almost impossible to reconstruct a complete picture of what happened, but part of the information was painstakingly gathered from the testimonies of eyewitnesses, including the neighbour, the grandmother, and Poppy's biological father, as well as from physical evidence. However, many of the documents contained contradictions and disputed points. While Cobus was being interrogated, officers decided to speak with Louisa. The woman stated that the day before, on October 24th, Poppy had bumped into a cupboard. The following morning, her behaviour had changed. She seemed lethargic, barely spoke, and moved little. Shortly after lunch, Cobus returned home in a bad mood, as usual. Louisa tried to explain that Poppy and Johann were not feeling well, but he did not listen and grew aggressive, as he always did. The victim's mother reported that this happened almost daily. She did not wait for it to end, but simply went out shopping. It is notable that she spoke of this quite calmly. When Louisa returned, she heard from Cobus that Poppy was getting worse. The mother found her daughter in the empty bathtub and noticed that her skin was very cold and her lips had turned blue. They tried to administer first aid, without success, and then decided to take her to the hospital, placing her in the back of the bakkie. This became one of the strangest moments in the entire story. Instead of carefully carrying Poppy in their arms, they laid her on the open flatbed, where she shifted around with the vehicle's movement. This detail later served as a convenient explanation for her numerous injuries. When the grandmother saw the state of her granddaughter, she could not believe her own daughter could have been involved. Like everyone else, she rejected the idea that this could have resulted from an accidental collision with furniture. The experts who investigated the case concluded that Poppy had been subjected to negative influences over a prolonged period. Numerous pieces of evidence were identified indicating the systematic nature of what had occurred, suggesting that Poppy had become the target of deliberate actions. When word of this reached residents, they began expressing outrage toward the imprisoned Cobus, who was repeatedly subjected to physical attacks and pressure while in custody. Louisa, however, initially seemed to remain off the authorities' radar despite her own inaction. Gradually, though, the townspeople learned of the mother's possible involvement in the incident, as well as the stepfather's, and they decided to express their outrage. On the eve of the farewell ceremony on November 4th, 2016, two unknown women dressed as police officers approached Louisa. They convinced her to go with them, supposedly to give a statement, but in reality they took her out of town and subjected her to a violent assault. It turned out these women were not real police officers, but residents who had decided to take justice into their own hands. As a result, Poppy's mother arrived at her daughter's farewell ceremony in a state similar to Poppy's own, though, unlike her, alive. Poppy's biological father, Christo van der Merwe, did not hide his emotions during the ceremony. He sat in the front row alongside friends and family, placing the blame entirely on his ex-wife, who, in his opinion, had never been a good mother. Louisa's face, which showed signs of the recent assault, remained emotionless throughout the entire service, as though what had happened to her daughter did not affect her at all. Louisa was arrested on December 15, 2016, and charged with offences similar to those brought against her husband. Despite the case's initially rapid progress, the trial was postponed by a year. Hearings did not begin until October 2017. There were several reasons for the delay. First, no lawyer could be found willing to represent the interests of the accused. Defense attorneys felt an aversion toward the suspects and refused to work with them. However, the postponement of the hearings ultimately proved advantageous for the prosecution. The additional time was enough to thoroughly interview Johan, the surviving brother. The boy stated that his stepfather regularly used violence against him and his sister, while their mother only watched and even covered for her husband rather than trying to help them. According to the boy, the physical abuse was so severe that at times the noise drowned out his and his sister's cries of pain. The boy's statements proved crucial to the case against his mother. Until the very end, Louisa tried to justify herself. When she brought her daughter to the hospital, she claimed she had tried to resuscitate her, splashing water on her face and performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Johan told a different version. His sister had been wet because after the incident, the stepfather had submerged her head in water in an attempt to revive her, and, according to Johan, their mother simply stood in the doorway watching this entire procedure without intervening. In the end, both were found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In addition, each received a further 10 years for endangering the well-being of the older child, who miraculously avoided severe consequences despite the regular abuse. Even the presiding judge, Bert Bam, expressed his outrage when handing down the sentence. He said he was shocked not only by the couple's actions, but by their complete indifference to what had happened, calling them inherently evil for abusing the toddler for 8 months before her death. Everyone present at the hearings agreed that the accused did not care about Poppy's fate, but only about the punishment they themselves would receive. During the trial, numerous reports emerged of the neighbour's repeated appeals to social services, in which he asked that the family be investigated on suspicion of child abuse. Yet no one ever responded adequately to his warnings. Social workers who should have contacted the police later excused their inaction by citing distances and bureaucratic difficulties that had prevented them from responding to the family situation in time. They were never held accountable for their negligence. In the aftermath, an advocacy group known as the Go Purple Foundation, which supports victims of abuse and molestation, announced it intended to pursue at least 7 individuals in Orania who were said to have turned a blind eye to Poppy's suffering, arguing that the town's collective silence had been just as damaging as the violence carried out behind closed doors. Poppy's grandmother, Carla van der Merwe, broke down in tears of relief upon hearing the sentence, embracing the lead investigator, Sergeant Gift Motome, in gratitude for his work on the case. She said that while the sentence could never bring her granddaughter back, she was thankful that her killers would spend the rest of their lives in prison, closing one chapter of a case that had shaken the small farming town of Orania to its core. There is a particular silence that exists only in small towns at Christmas time. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of trust. Doors left unlocked, kids walking home alone because nothing bad ever happens here, not really, and in Dryden, New York, tucked into the snowy folds of the Finger Lakes region east of Ithaca, that silence had held for generations, until the morning of December 23, 1989, when it broke and wouldn't be whole again for a decade. This is the story of the Harris family, a story about a Christmas tree with presents still wrapped beneath it, about a smoke detector that worked exactly as it was supposed to and still wasn't fast enough, and about a police investigator so hungry to close a case that he manufactured the evidence with his own hands, nearly letting the truth stay buried forever. Warren Harris, everyone called him Tony, had spent 15 years building a career as a sales director for an electronics company in Syracuse, and in 1986 he and his wife Dolores, who went by Dodie, made the move so many young families dream about, out of the city and into a spacious home they built themselves at 1886 Ellis Hollow Road, just outside Dryden. Dodie, 41, had an easy, welcoming charm and a gift for baking that turned into a small local legend. Neighbours would find a loaf of fresh bread on their porch for no reason at all. She sat on the school board, threw herself into charity work, and eventually converted a barn on the property into a gift shop selling handmade crafts and holiday keepsakes. Their kids were, by every account, wonderful. Shelby, 15, was a sophomore at Dryden High, bright and social, with a boyfriend named James, and Mark, 11, was still at the age where a snow day meant nothing but snowball fights. The Harrises weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable, generous, and woven tightly into their community, and if you'd asked anyone in Dryden to name a family with no enemies in the world, they'd have named the Harrises, which is precisely what made what happened to them so incomprehensible. Friday, December 22, 1989, was the last day of classes before Christmas break, the kind of afternoon that should have blurred into every other pre-holiday Friday a family has ever had. Shelby spent time with James after school before catching the bus, getting off near her stop around 3:30 p.m. And she and James had plans to meet again around 7 that evening. That same afternoon, Dodie's friend Rita stopped by the gift shop to pick up some items. The shop was open, but Dodie wasn't inside, and calls to the house went unanswered, so Rita and Dodie arranged for Dodie to drop the items off at 6:30 instead. Mark got off the school bus around 4 and stayed out with friends throwing snowballs, and about 50 minutes later, Dodie was on the phone with her friend Anne, chatting about an upcoming sports event, sounding completely her cheerful self. At 3:55, Tony clocked out of work in Syracuse for the 15-minute drive home, eager to see how Dodie had decorated for the holidays. Then silence. Rita waited at 6:30 for a delivery that never came. James waited at 7 for Shelby, who never showed. His calls to the house kept getting a busy signal over and over, and he assumed she'd simply lost track of time and would call back later, going to bed without much more thought. Nobody heard from the Harris family again that night. Around 7 a.m. Saturday, a neighbour was jolted awake by a smoke detector blaring from across the street, the Harris house, and he waited, hoping it was a false alarm, but it wasn't, and no one answered the door, so he called the police. The responding officer expected the ordinary holiday season call, a forgotten pan, nothing more, since Dryden was quiet and serious. Incidents were rare. But pulling up the driveway, he noticed tire tracks cutting an unusual path across the lawn, as if a vehicle had left in a hurry. The alarm was still audible from outside, and knocking and ringing the bell got no response. His mind went to a domestic accident. Someone hurt cooking, driven themselves to the hospital and to check. He entered through the unlocked garage, where inside he found smoke and a heavy smell of gasoline. And worse, the phone lines into the house had been cut. The living room was empty, a decorated Christmas tree standing over a pile of unopened presents, and upstairs, in the bedroom belonging to the family's eldest child, the officer found Shelby. He radioed for backup and kept clearing the house, and by the time more officers and emergency crews arrived, they found 3 more victims in the first-floor master bedroom. Tony and Dodie had been bound to their bed. Mark lay beside them. The restraints were improvised and cruel, ropes, cut cords, even a wire coat hanger twisted to bind Tony and Dodie together. Pillowcases had been forced over all 3 heads. Shelby had been tied separately to a chair with cords and a bent hanger of her own, and investigators later found fragments of the dress she'd planned to wear to her school's Christmas dance, torn apart and used as part of her restraints. The medical examiner's findings made clear the killer hadn't been in a hurry, and before she died, Shelby had been tortured, raped and sodomized, with investigators later estimating the family's ordeal stretched from around 6 p.m. that evening until as late as 10 p.m., 4 hours in their own home on the last day of school before Christmas, and every member of the family had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. Fire investigators quickly determined the blaze had been set deliberately, with multiple points of origin scattered through the house, an attempt to consume as much evidence as possible, with parts of the upper floor doused in gasoline before ignition, and it very nearly worked. Investigators reconstructed a chilling timeline. The killer had entered the home sometime between roughly 4:30 and 5 p.m. the previous afternoon, threatened the family at gunpoint, and stayed with them for hours, apparently leaving around 10:30 that night, then returned near sunrise to erase his tracks, setting the fire around 6:45 a.m. And the same smoke detector that had first drawn the neighbours' attention caught the blaze almost instantly. The 911 call went out at 6:58. Several fuel containers were recovered from the scene. Investigators suspected the gasoline came from Tony's own supply in the garage, and cigarette butts were found throughout the house, a detail that stood out immediately since nobody in the Harris family smoked, and it was nearly the only physical evidence left behind, and one of very few, since the scene had the unmistakable feel of having been wiped down deliberately. No usable fingerprints, not a single spent shell casing. The surfaces most likely to hold prints had been doused in gasoline and burned along with everything else. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. Someone the Harrises knew, or had no reason to fear, had simply been let inside. That detail alone reshaped the town, and Dryden was the kind of place where a knock on the door at night wasn't cause for alarm. That sense of safety had never once been questioned before that morning, and now residents who'd never locked a car door found themselves eyeing their own neighbours, because everyone agreed on one thing: the Harrises had no enemies, no criminal ties, no debts, nothing in their lives that explained becoming the target of such calculated brutality, and that senselessness was, in its way, more frightening than almost anything else about the case. By the next morning, investigators located the Harris family's van, abandoned in a mall parking lot roughly 7 kilometres west of the house, and reports surfaced almost simultaneously that the family's bank and credit cards had been used, ATM withdrawals across the city, and on December 23rd, purchases at several shopping centres, giving investigators a rough timeline of how the perpetrator had spent the hours after the murders. This was 1989, well before developed surveillance networks, so investigators leaned heavily on eyewitnesses, particularly store clerks, and a man had used Tony's card 4 separate times. A woman had used Dodie's the same number of times, both drawing attention for the scale of their purchases, appliances, electronics, clothing, expensive jewellery, as if stolen credit were being treated like a holiday windfall. One clerk recalled a customer who reeked of gasoline and had oil-stained pants, and helped police build a composite sketch, later refined with more witness input, and police were now looking for a man in his early 30s and a woman in her 50s. The sketches went public the same day, and tips poured in. One came from a university professor living about 1 kilometre from the crime scene, who reported seeing the Harris family's own van moving slowly along the road the morning of December 23rd, driven, he said, by a man he recognised, with an older woman in the passenger seat. And he knew them. They were neighbours, a mother and her adult son. More witnesses followed, repeating the same names, and the alleged accomplice was identified as 54-year-old Shirley King, a woman with no criminal record and a reputation as a respectable, law-abiding member of the community. And her son was 33-year-old Michael King, also known by the alias Anthony Turner, and unlike his mother, Michael had a substantial criminal history. Michael King's record stretched back to 1979, when he was convicted of burglary. He was paroled by February 1980 and settled with his girlfriend and young daughter into one half of a duplex on Etna Road in Dryden. His mother lived in the other half, and in 1982 he was arrested again, this time for possessing an arsenal of weapons, and while awaiting trial, he reportedly told people he regretted not resisting arrest. a comment that would take on a darker meaning later. His history was overwhelmingly home invasions carried out with firearms. Nothing in it, prior to the Harris case, involved serious violence directly against people, and investigators, despite mounting suspicion, hadn't yet been able to make anything stick, so he was placed under surveillance. Neighbours described Michael and Shirley as withdrawn. In 2 years at the duplex, they'd barely interacted with anyone around them. And the landlord later revealed that just before the murders, Michael and his girlfriend owed roughly $600 in back rent and $550 in additional expenses, and the day after the killings, that debt was suddenly mysteriously settled. On December 26th, a man named Stephen May walked into a police station. He'd known Michael King since the late 1970s and had a confession of his own. He'd once been King's partner in a Christmas season burglary, and he described King in unnerving terms. Like the Grinch, he said, someone who seemed to take satisfaction in ruining a different family's holiday every single year. May said he'd visited Kinga the day after the murders and been shown homemade weapons and modified devices Kinga had built himself, and that Kinga had acquired a weapons cache from a female acquaintance back in January 1987, specifications that lined up disturbingly well with evidence from the Harris scene, including a silencer that would explain why neighbours had never heard gunshots. Shirley King, meanwhile, worked as a housekeeper, cleaning private homes and also working the front desk and cleaning rooms at a well-regarded bed and breakfast, the Peregrine House in Ithaca. On January 30th, 1990, an undercover investigator checked into the Peregrine House as a guest. His name was David Harding, by every account a rising star in the state police's fingerprint identification unit. Intelligent, driven, with a reputation for finding evidence in cases that seemed like dead ends, and recently divorced. Colleagues joked he'd simply remarried his job, and the Harris case was handed to him with particular urgency. Working under the alias David Savage, Harding got close to Shirley King. She told him about her dream of opening a hospice on 200 acres of land she owned upstate, and Harding, posing as a well-connected businessman, offered to help her find funding, exactly the kind of proposal likely to build trust. Along the way, he noticed two things. Shirley reacted with unusual emotional intensity to news coverage of criminal suspects, and she smoked an uncommon cigarette brand, matching the butts found at the Harris scene. Wearing a fake cast as part of his cover, Harding asked Shirley to help address invitations for a fake alumni reunion. She agreed, signing 25 envelopes, including one addressed to a Dolores, a name chosen deliberately to compare her handwriting against the signature found on the victim's credit card receipts. Then, using the pretext of asking for a glass of orange juice, Harding lifted a physical fingerprint sample from her directly. Shirley mentioned two other sons living out of state, but never once brought up Michael or his aliases, and asked about past trouble with the law. She reacted unusually, but kept her composure. Despite the earlier consensus that no usable prints existed at the Harris scene, Harding insisted the search simply hadn't been thorough enough, and in short order appeared vindicated just 2 days after meeting Shirley in person. He reported finding her fingerprint on a fuel container recovered from inside the house. Combined with the mounting circumstantial evidence, it was enough, and formal charges were filed against both suspects. On February 7, 1990, a special unit moved on the Etna Road duplex. Informants had described a substantial weapons cache inside, and Michael had reportedly said he'd welcome a violent confrontation rather than be taken alive. So a rescue helicopter was put on standby and paramedics waited nearby. When officers entered Michael's bedroom, they found him armed, ordered to surrender. He rose abruptly instead. A shot rang out, officers returned fire, and King was killed. And a bullet fragment later recovered from the ceiling supported the officer's account of the confrontation, while Shirley King was already in custody on the other side of the duplex. A search of Michael's half turned up a workshop, workbench, machine tools, fabrication equipment, reportedly used to make handcrafted tools and sharpen implements he sold informally. And investigators found examples scattered through the house, along with a substantial quantity of ammunition, plus a bicycle they theorized he'd used to approach the Harris house quietly the night of the murders. On Shirley's side, they found cigarettes matching the crime scene brand, and seized a lighter purchased the same day a store clerk had reported a strange customer smelling of gasoline. And in Michael's bedroom they found a modified .22 caliber weapon matching what May had already described, and ballistics testing tied it directly to the killings. Under interrogation, Shirley maintained her innocence, insisting investigators were building a case against her without real foundation. And she admitted her son had given her someone else's credit card, but claimed she'd never asked where it came from, denying any wrongdoing and arguing it would have been senseless to help destroy an entire family over a few $1,000s in stolen purchases. Her story later shifted, and she admitted knowing what her son had done, while insisting she'd had no idea of his intentions beforehand, saying she learned of the murders from the news, then confronted Michael, who confessed and explained he'd acted out of fear the family could identify him. And she said she scolded him, but never reported him. A follow-up investigation undercut that account, and on one of the fuel containers, investigators, per Harding's reporting, identified a small partial print attributed to Shirley, suggesting that even if she hadn't been present for the murders, she'd returned afterward to help clean up. And investigators noted, pointedly, that her professional experience as a housekeeper made her unusually well equipped for exactly that kind of work. In early August 1990, Shirley's case went to trial on 12 charges, including complicity in burglary, tampering with the crime scene, arson, possession of stolen property, and obstruction of justice. And some of the more severe charges were later dropped for lack of evidence. Michael's girlfriend, who'd been living at the duplex and was present that Christmas, testified that Michael had left twice during the night without explaining where, and that while Shirley had stayed with her, she suspected Shirley had slipped out to be with him at some point, which investigators believed reflected the aftermath, when Shirley allegedly helped cover his tracks. The prosecution's central witness was David Harding. His testimony, detailed, confident, emotionally compelling, appeared to convince the jury beyond doubt, and Shirley was found guilty on every count and sentenced to 17 to 44 years, with parole eligibility after 18, and throughout she insisted she'd never known the card's rightful owner and had never set foot in the Harris home, accusing Harding directly of manipulating evidence to close the case. And at the time, nobody believed her. In early 1991, David Harding applied for a job with the CIA, and during the required polygraph exam, he failed questions specifically tied to the Kingley case, raising immediate red flags about fabricated evidence. A closer review followed, and what investigators found was staggering. The fingerprint supposedly discovered on the fuel can, the single piece of evidence that had done more than anything else to convict Shirley King, had never actually existed at the scene, and the forensic experts who'd originally processed the house confirmed they'd found nothing of the kind. And Harding had lifted Shirley's real print from a drinking glass during one of their meetings, then claimed to have discovered it on the gas can. Harding and a fellow trooper who'd known about and covered for it were implicated in similar misconduct elsewhere, and that colleague was Robert Lishansky, who admitted to fabricating fingerprint evidence in roughly 300 separate cases. Most worked entirely alone, the rest involving other troopers. In November 1992, Harding formally confessed to fabricating evidence and making false statements, not just in Shirley's case, but others too, and he was sentenced to 4 to 12 years for perjury, while Lishansky received 6 to 18 years, reflecting the scale of what he'd admitted to. Their confessions became the starting point for a sweeping internal review of State Police Troop C, exposing a pattern of fabricated evidence stretching back to 1984 across more than 30 criminal cases, and supervisors, including the lieutenant heading the identification unit, were found to have known and done nothing, so sweeping reforms in evidence handling followed. After Harding's confession, Shirley King was released, having spent roughly 2.5 years behind bars, and she never denied her actual crimes, using stolen credit cards, related forgery, and had already served that portion of her sentence. But the far more serious charges tying her to the murders and the clean-up had rested almost entirely on evidence one trooper had manufactured by hand. Free again, Shirley King pursued compensation through New York's Court of Claims, initially seeking damages in the hundreds of millions for what the wrongful conviction had cost her, and the court sided with her. And in a ruling finalized in 2009, Judge Nicholas Meady found the state liable on 2 grounds: malicious prosecution and negligent supervision of David Harding, writing that the near-total absence of oversight had given Harding the time and opportunity to fabricate fingerprint evidence, which ultimately became the only significant evidence placing her at the Harris home. And without it, the court found, there had never been legitimate grounds to prosecute her for the murders at all. The state was ordered to pay Shirley King $312, a figure often rounded in press coverage to $250,000, and the judge noted she hadn't come to court with entirely clean hands, given her admitted use of a card belonging to one of the victims, but on the core question of whether she'd helped murder or burn down the Harris family's home, the court found the state's case had been built on a lie planted by its own investigator. Years later, Shirley said what she'd wanted most, sitting through Harding's testimony, was simply to look him in the eye, certain she'd have seen the truth underneath it, and she moved from Tompkins County to Atlanta roughly 18 years before her death, seeking real distance from what had happened to her, and by most accounts never fully recovered from it, dying in September 2015 at 80 after a brief illness. Michael King never stood trial. He never had the chance to answer for what investigators believed, with substantial evidence he'd done, because he was killed the moment police tried to take him into custody. And in the strictest legal sense, he was never convicted of murdering Tony, Dodie, Shelby and Mark Harris, but in every practical sense, the ballistics match tying his weapon to the fatal wounds, the weapons cache matching crime scene evidence in specific detail, eyewitnesses placing him and his mother near the stolen van the next morning, physical evidence from his own workshop, and the account of his former accomplice. The case against Michael King was, in the eyes of investigators and of history, about as complete as it could be without a verdict to formalise it. What makes this story so uniquely unsettling isn't only the brutality of that night on Ellis Hollow Road, a family of 4, tied up in their own bedrooms, terrorised for hours, executed. It's that the drive to secure a conviction against Shirley King, a woman genuinely guilty of comparatively minor crimes, led one investigator to manufacture the very evidence meant to deliver justice, nearly ensuring the actual truth stayed buried under fabricated fingerprints, until a CIA job interview of all things brought it undone. Dryden, meanwhile, didn't get to close this chapter quietly, and the Harris murders turned out to be the first in a string of tragedies that struck the small town over the following decade. Enough sorrow in such a small population that the town eventually became the subject of a true crime docuseries asking whether Dryden was somehow cursed, though long-time residents rejected that framing outright, saying it wasn't a curse. It was a series of individual, devastating human choices that happened to fall on the same small patch of upstate New York. The house at 1886 Ellis Hollow Road is gone now, decades removed from that December, and what remains is the record, court documents, exoneration files, newspaper archives, describing how a family's last ordinary evening became one of the most disturbing crimes in the region's history, and how the pursuit of justice for them was, for a time, hijacked by the very system meant to deliver it. And Tony, Dodie, Shelby and Mark Harris spent their final hours of freedom decorating a home for Christmas. The presents were still wrapped, sitting untouched beneath the tree, when police found them the next morning, and they never got the chance to open them. There is a storage unit in Denver, Colorado, on the 5,000 block of East Evans Avenue that looks like every other storage unit in America. Roll-up doors, a padlock, rows of units full of Christmas decorations, old furniture, boxes labelled MISC. But on December 23, 2018, 2 nights before Christmas, detectives pried open a rectangular object wrapped in layer after layer of black garbage bags and silver duct tape. It was about 3 feet tall, 2 feet wide, and heavy in a way that plastic and cardboard should never be. Inside, they found a dog crate, and inside that dog crate, a block of solid concrete. And inside that concrete, a 7-year-old boy named Caden McWilliams, a boy his own school principal once said had a smile that could light up a room. A boy who, according to the doctor who finally examined what was left of him, had been starved down to just 26 pounds. A boy whose own mother would later admit under oath that she heard him screaming and did nothing. This is his story, a boy who deserved so much better than the family he was born into. Caden McWilliams was born on December 20th, 2010 in Colorado to Elisha Pankey and Leland Pankey. The couple had married in 2014, and not long after they had a daughter, Caden's little sister. But behind the scenes, the family's life was falling apart. In early 2018, they were evicted from their home, and from that point on, home became a rotation of extended stay hotels around the Denver and Aurora area, the kind of budget hotels families use when they've run out of options and are trying to stay one step ahead of homelessness. For a while, though, none of that touched Caden's world at school. During the 2017 to 2018 school year, he was a student at Ellis Elementary School in Denver. His principal, Nicole Whitman, would later describe him as a hard-working, high-achieving kid, always upbeat and kind, someone who embodied the school's core value of integrity. His eyes and his smile radiated warmth and empathy. Other kids wanted to be his friend, and they came to him for advice, even at 7 years old. His teacher, Christina Hafler, remembered him the same way, as a bright, joyful child who got along easily with everyone. Caden's last day at Ellis Elementary was May 24, 2018, even though the school year didn't officially end until the 31st. That gap matters, because in August of that year, Elisha told the school administration she was pulling Caden out to homeschool him. He was never enrolled anywhere else. He was never seen by a teacher again. And by the time anyone in an official capacity started asking hard questions about where he actually was, Caden McWilliams had already been dead for months. While all of this was unfolding, Elisha was, on paper, employed, working for a company called EHS Market, which later merged with SP Global as a temporary employee whose contract was extended into early August 2018. Here's the detail that stands out. Most employees at her company were allowed to work remotely, but Elisha wasn't one of them, not because she had to be in the office, but because she chose to be. She reportedly spent around 95% of her working hours physically at the office, telling co-workers she was simply more comfortable there than at home. She ate lunch at her desk and often stayed late, long after everyone else had gone home. At the time, it probably read as dedication. In hindsight, it reads like something else entirely, a woman who could not bring herself to go back to the hotel room where her son was. The case that would eventually expose all of this didn't start as a missing child investigation. It started as a domestic violence call. On December 21, 2018, Aurora police officers and detectives responded to an extended stay hotel on East Evans Avenue after a report of domestic violence. There they met 41-year-old Elisha, who had called police on her own husband Leland. The couple, it turned out, weren't even living together anymore. Leland was renting a room at a different hotel, the Town Place Suites in Denver. As officers worked the scene, they learned the couple had 2 children, a young daughter and a 7-year-old son named Caden. When asked where the kids were, Elisha told them both children were with their father. But while officers were talking with her, they noticed something else in the hotel room, a substance they believed was an illegal drug. That discovery sealed the room and triggered a search warrant application. While Elisha was being taken in for questioning, detectives began searching the room in earnest. They found what they suspected were illegal drugs, and they found something small and easy to overlook. A business card for a storage facility on East Evans Avenue with an access code written on the back. Detective Brandon Meadows followed up with the storage facility's management and learned that Elisha had rented a unit there starting May 17, 2018. Meanwhile, police in both Denver and Aurora tracked down Leland at his hotel. They found him in the parking lot climbing into a black 2009 BMW. There was already an active arrest warrant out for him for domestic violence, with Elisha listed as the victim. Officers took him into custody and had the car towed, and a quick search of the vehicle turned up more suspected illegal drugs. While in custody, Leland told police his daughter was staying at a child care centre near the intersection of I-25 and Parker Road. But the moment the conversation turned to Caden, he started dodging, deflecting, changing the subject. Eventually, he suggested vaguely that the boy might be with a relative, since he himself couldn't have picked Caden up given the active warrant against him. It didn't add up, and it wouldn't for long. Leland was formally arrested and booked into the Aurora Police Department. What happened over the next several days has only been partially reconstructed because large portions of the official case file were redacted before becoming public. On December 22nd, Aurora Detective Jeffrey Pins interviewed a 24-year-old woman, her name withheld from the case file, who said that roughly 3 weeks earlier, Leland had told her that Caden had died. According to her, Leland seemed to be struggling badly with it. He kept saying he couldn't cope with the loss and that he needed psychological help. He also brought up the storage unit, telling her his relatives could go grab some belongings from it. Later, he told her he wanted nothing more to do with that unit at all because it was tied to something too painful. Around the same time, investigators went to the child care centre on Parker Road and confirmed the daughter really was there. A staff member told them something chilling in hindsight. On November 29th, Leland had specifically asked the centre to help expand his daughter's social circle because, he said, she'd lost her brother. Meanwhile, back at the Aurora Police Department, both Elisha and Leland were being questioned about Caden's whereabouts. At a certain point, both invoked their right to an attorney and stopped answering questions altogether. On December 23rd, Detective Brandon Medus prepared a search warrant for the storage unit the couple had been renting. A judge signed off the same day. That morning, officers from the Crimes Against Children unit arrived at the facility along with 2 K9 teams, both dogs specifically trained to detect human remains. At around 9:50 a.m., a facility employee cut the padlock off the Pankey's unit, and detectives raised the door. Inside was what you'd expect from any storage unit: plastic storage bins, a large pile of clothing, items pushed into the back. But there were other things too: several large water jugs and partially used bags of concrete mix. Fine grey concrete dust covered a large portion of the floor. And against the east wall of the unit sat a rectangular object wrapped in multiple tight layers of black trash bags and silver duct tape, about 3 feet tall and roughly 2 feet wide. Handlers Katie Bryant and Millie Sackind released the cadaver dogs into the unit, but at first there was no alert. Then Detective Patrick McGinty began carefully cutting through the layers of black plastic wrapped around the object. A few layers in, he caught the smell. The dogs were brought back in, and this time both alerted immediately, the exact trained response their handlers had been watching for. At that point, the search stopped. The unit was sealed and held for the Denver Police Department's Homicide Unit. Detective Kari Johnson from Denver Homicide prepared a fresh warrant based on what Aurora investigators had found. Detectives Marty Smith and Kari Johnson then entered the unit to conduct a formal search, documenting and photographing items believed to have evidentiary value, including that wrapped rectangular object, which turned out to be a pet carrier completely encased in concrete. Denver police bomb technician Kurt Peterson ran an X-ray scan on it, but the images weren't clear enough to identify what was inside, so the block was transported to the Denver Medical Examiner's office for further examination. By around 10 p.m., Denver PD's forensic team had finished collecting visible evidence at the scene, and Detective Smith resealed the unit and placed a new lock on it the following day. On Christmas Eve, while most of Denver was gathering with family for the holiday, staff at the medical examiner's office extracted human remains from the concrete block. A preliminary look suggested the remains belonged to a minor. Decomposition was severe enough that visual identification wasn't possible. Later that same day, a judge signed a third search warrant for the storage unit, and Detective Marty Smith, working with the forensic lab, completed a full documentation of everything inside. On December 29th, an Aurora police sergeant named John Kessler contacted Detective Marty Smith with an unexpected lead. His colleagues were at an extended stay hotel with a woman who claimed to have information about Caden and what had happened to him. According to the witness, she had been staying at the hotel with Elisha, who had told her about Caden's death and said his body was at the storage facility. Detective Smith went to the hotel personally to meet her, and she agreed to go to Denver Police Headquarters for a formal interview. She explained how she and Elisha had met in the Arapahoe County Jail on December 22nd. The two women were held in the same block and were released on the exact same day, December 24th. Despite knowing Elisha for only 2 days, the witness moved in with her at the hotel after their release. She even accompanied Elisha to Arapahoe County Court, where detectives showed up, took a DNA swab from Elisha, and named her a suspect in Caden's death. The witness said that the day before, Elisha had laid out her version of events in detail. According to that account, Leland frequently abused Caden and would force him into a pet carrier. Elisha admitted she did the same thing herself, putting Caden in the carrier whenever she wanted to shower or take care of something without him underfoot. Then, in late July, Leland put Caden in the carrier again and covered it with a blanket. Elisha allegedly said she could hear her son complaining that he was hot, begging for water. She never went to him. The next morning, she told the witness, she found Caden dead inside the carrier. The witness also said Leland personally checked on Caden and confirmed there were no signs of life. From there, according to what Elisha reportedly told her, the crate with Caden's body inside was loaded into their car. The couple bought concrete mix, drove to the storage unit, poured concrete into the carrier and wrapped it in layer after layer of trash bags. At that stage, all of this rested entirely on second-hand testimony, but it gave investigators for the first time a coherent and horrifying shape for what had happened. Based on this statement, Detective Smith prepared an arrest warrant for Elisha. On January 2, 2019, Elisha turned herself in to Denver police and was booked into the city jail. 5 days later, Denver District Attorney Beth McCann announced formal charges, child abuse resulting in death, and abuse of a corpse. On January 8th, investigators confirmed that Elisha had signed a rental agreement on May 17, 2018, and had been issued a personal access code that was deactivated once the rental ended. On January 10th, DNA results came back, confirming that Elisha and Leland were the biological parents of the child whose remains had been found. It was now official. The body was Caden's. On January 15th, crime scene investigator Michael Bush reviewed surveillance footage from the storage complex covering May through December of 2018. The footage showed Elisha and Leland repeatedly entering the facility, sometimes together, sometimes separately, both visiting the unit and making rental payments over that period. On January 20th, Detective Marty Smith interviewed Leland with attorneys present. Leland denied ever having a key to the storage unit and claimed his only access had come during the initial move, when the family's belongings were placed there after the eviction. He insisted that after he and Elisha split up, he never went back to the unit. The evidence told a different story. Access logs and surveillance footage showed that on September 27, 2018, Leland used his own access code to enter the complex and spent roughly 30 minutes inside. On February 28th, the Denver Medical Examiner's Office released its autopsy report. Forensic pathologist Dr. Meredith Frank's conclusion was that Caden's death was a homicide. The exact mechanism of death couldn't be pinpointed, but child maltreatment was identified as a significant contributing factor. Dr. Frank also noted signs of extreme emaciation, consistent with severe malnutrition or prolonged food deprivation. At the time of his death, 7-year-old Caden weighed approximately 26 pounds. Beyond the starvation, examiners found numerous injuries to his head, torso, and limbs. Some of the injuries showed signs of healing, meaning they had happened while he was still alive, at some point before his death. Investigators and medical examiners also considered the possibility of death by asphyxiation or hypothermia, neither of which could be confirmed. Toxicology also found methamphetamine in his system. Dr. Frank's final determination weighed all of it together, the autopsy findings and the simple, devastating fact that a child that age was entirely dependent on his parents for his survival. Together, that was enough to classify his death as a homicide. On March 15th, Elisha was interviewed at Denver Police Headquarters with the prosecutor and both of her attorneys present. This time, Elisha gave her account of what happened. She said that in late May 2018, the family moved into an in-town suites hotel on West Hampton Avenue in Sheridan, Colorado. At that point, she was still working full-time, typically leaving the room around 8 a.m. and not returning until noon. During those hours, she said, Leland was solely responsible for caring for Caden and his sister. Elisha admitted she knew Leland was abusing Caden and that he was going hungry. She said that around July 11, 2018, shortly before Caden's death, she woke up to Leland yelling and saw him holding Caden by the neck. He then took Caden into the bathroom, and she said she could hear the sounds of him being struck, though she claimed she never heard Caden cry out. She said that afterward, Leland left Caden alone in the bathroom with the door shut and told her they wouldn't be able to raise both children. He talked, she said, about wanting to take Caden into the mountains and leave him there. In the days before Caden's death, she said Leland reinforced the side panel of the pet carrier. And on the day they found Caden dead, she said they bought trash bags, concrete mix and water, then drove his body to the rented storage unit, mixed the concrete and poured it over the carrier. Elisha insisted this all happened in mid-July 2018. Investigators didn't buy the timeline. Based on the evidence, Caden's last day of school, the surveillance footage, the access logs, they believed he had actually died much earlier, likely in May, not long after he stopped going to school entirely. On May 24, 2019, Detective Smith filed for an arrest warrant for Leland Pankey. He was charged with first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, and tampering with evidence related to his son's body. In early 2020, prosecutors reached a plea agreement with Leland. The first-degree murder charge was dropped in exchange for a guilty plea to the lesser charge of child abuse resulting in death, negligent rather than intentional in the legal framing, along with the charge of tampering with a deceased body. Leland was sentenced to 72 years in prison, the maximum allowed. Elisha, for her role in Caden's death, was sentenced to 32 years in prison, followed by 5 years of mandatory parole supervision after release. Denver District Attorney Beth McCann explained that prosecutors had to weigh the risks of a longer trial on a first-degree murder charge, especially given that the exact cause of death could never be definitively established, and that they wanted to spare Caden's surviving relatives, along with the judge and any jury, from having to relive the full details of a case that many law enforcement officers involved called one of the most disturbing of their careers. Still, prosecutors were clear that Leland's actions were intentional, calculated, and showed a total absence of compassion for his son. At Leland's sentencing, Elisha's sister, Sarah Cruz, spoke about her nephew. She said she was there when Caden was born and loved him from his first moments of life. Even as a small child, she said, Caden carried a maturity beyond his years. He was kind, calm, and caring, and he loved everyone around him without reservation. Today, Sarah is the legal guardian of Caden's little sister. She's described her niece as a genuine miracle, someone who survived circumstances that could easily have ended in tragedy for her too. The only positive that has come out of this terrible situation is my niece, Cruz said. She is a miracle. She's a survivor, and she is precious. She also promised that Caden's story wouldn't be reduced to a headline, that his memory would push for change and give a voice to children who, like him, never got the chance to speak up for themselves. After Caden's death became public, his former teacher, Christina Hafler, helped organize a fundraiser in his memory through the school's parent-teacher organization. The plan was to install a memorial bench, plant a tree, and commission a piece of community artwork near Ellis Elementary. The goal was around $5,000, but the community ultimately raised closer to $6,210, enough to fully fund the project. A mural painted on a street in Denver features a tree, a bumblebee, and a dinosaur, images chosen by Caden's former classmates because they reminded them of how much he loved nature. Near the school's entrance, a bright orange bench now stands in his honor, and nearby a tree was planted in his memory. One of the most active people behind the memorial effort was a woman named Brooke Webb. She never actually knew Caden personally, but her daughter attended the same school and often saw him in the hallways. Webb has said the news of his death shook the entire local community and that it hit teachers, parents and neighbours especially hard. She said she believes that if the people around Caden had known what he was truly going through, many of them would have tried to step in. In the aftermath, Webb reached out to lawmakers to push for changes related to so-called safe haven laws, the legal mechanisms that let parents surrender children to the state safely when they're unable to care for them. Her argument was straightforward. Those protections currently focus on infants. She believes society needs to think seriously about creating similar forms of support for families struggling to care for older children in crisis before those situations turn fatal. Beyond the advocacy work, Webb also ran an online group dedicated to keeping Caden's memory alive, where she shared updates about the investigation and the court proceedings as they unfolded. That's the story of Caden McWilliams, a boy his teachers, friends and classmates remember as kind, thoughtful and endlessly warm, with a smile that people who knew him still describe years later as impossible to forget. His death was, by every account from the people who investigated it, one of the most disturbing cases many of them had ever worked. But his life, the 7 years he had, was defined by something else entirely. A little boy who made friends easily, who other kids looked up to, who loved dinosaurs and bumblebees and trees enough that his classmates painted them on a wall in his memory. despite the horror of how his story ended. Caden's memory lives on at the school he loved, in the mural painted in his honour, on the bright orange bench outside Ellis Elementary, and in the hearts of everyone who was lucky enough to have known him. Oakley KB Headland came into the world on January 18, 2023, at Warren General Hospital in Pennsylvania, born to Tasha Marie Headland and Tyler Lee Prescott. From the very beginning, he was a family boy, tumbling around with his 4 brothers and sisters and pedaling his little tricycle wherever the rest of them went. He had plenty of toys of his own, but his mother Tasha always said Oakley marched to his own beat. He would rather get his hands on soda cans, car keys, or whatever chew toy he could steal from the family dog than play with anything actually meant for him. He loved climbing onto the furniture and riding on people's shoulders just so he could be the tallest person in the room for a minute. He was an affectionate kid, generous with hugs, and as a baby there was always somebody fighting for a turn to hold him. His older sister had long since outgrown wanting to play with little kids, but she made an exception for Oakley, showing him off to her school friends, who fell for him instantly. He adored his older brother most of all and followed him everywhere like a shadow, parking himself nearby whenever his brother was playing video games or watching TV. When his brother got a rocking chair for his birthday, Oakley claimed it the second his brother's back was turned, and at some point he swiped his brother's necklace, declared it his own, and wore it every single day after that. His father, Tyler Prescott, was a dangerous man who should never have been left alone with a child. Back in 2021, he was arrested and charged with aggravated assault under circumstances that placed a child's welfare at risk. The injured party in that case was not even a year old at the time. In September 2022, he was sentenced to 20 to 40 months in state prison on a child endangerment charge, along with 2 years of probation for creating a substantial risk of death to another person. The full details of that case were never made public, but the essential fact was this: the victim wasn't Oakley. Oakley hadn't even been born yet, and the child Tyler had already hurt had barely survived. Tyler walked out of prison on June 16, 2025, having served his maximum sentence, which under Pennsylvania law meant he left without any obligation to complete the 2 years of court-ordered supervision that had been attached to his case. Oakley's mother, Tasha, wanted her son to have some kind of relationship with his father, so she began bringing Oakley to see him. But when it came time to bring the boy home, Tyler started making excuses, dodging her calls, stalling. He had no fixed address, which made it nearly impossible for Tasha to know where her son actually was at any given moment. On July 21, 2025, Tyler posted a photo of Oakley sitting cross-legged on a wooden floor in a pair of sunglasses, captioned, "My Little Player." In early August, another photo surfaced, reportedly taken at a family birthday celebration, showing bruising visible on Oakley's face, leg, and chest. On August 10th, Tyler told Tasha he was heading to his grandmother's place in Harrisburg. The next day, Tasha texted that she missed Oakley and wanted him brought home. Tyler didn't respond. 2 days later, she tried again, asking if he was even still in town. He said no. He wasn't telling the truth. Around August 12th, 2 of Tyler's friends, Tyler Fenton and Kelsey Kabisky, invited him and the boy to stay at their home on Sherman Street in Bradford. To avoid confusing the 2 Tylers, I'll refer to the father by his last name from here on out. Kelsey noticed something different in the boy almost immediately. Oakley acted like an entirely different child whenever his father was nearby. Fenton worked nights and slept during the day. On the 13th, he woke up to a sound like someone kicking the wall, then again a short time later to the blare of smoke detectors going off. He found Oakley lying on the floor with no clothes on. Prescott hurriedly threw a blanket over the boy and told Fenton he'd been chain-smoking, and that was what had set off the alarm. Around 3 that afternoon, Kelsey knocked on Prescott's door to bum a cigarette. He blocked her view of the room and shut the door on her. Early the next morning, uneasy that something was seriously wrong, Kelsey called Fenton and asked him to go home and check on the child. Fenton got there in the early hours of August 14th and found Prescott and Oakley on a mattress laid straight on the floor. Prescott was asleep. Oakley wasn't moving, showed no signs of life, and his skin was cold. Fenton shook Prescott awake and tried to get him to start CPR, but Prescott was sluggish, slow to react, seemingly out of it. So Fenton started compressions himself, while someone else in the house on Sherman Street called 911. Paramedics from the Bradford Fire Department arrived and found the toddler unresponsive. Prescott met the officers at the door and paced in circles while medics worked on his son. Witnesses on scene said he looked agitated and appeared to be muttering to himself. Police pulled him aside to talk, and he was sweating heavily, struggling to keep his own story straight. He admitted he'd used illegal drugs in the days before. Oakley was rushed to Bradford Regional Medical Centre, where doctors tried everything they could. He died that same night. The cause was later determined to be a combination of traumatic injuries and toxicity from illegal substances. He was 2.5 years old. Just after 5 o'clock that morning, Prescott texted Tasha, "Tasha, I'm sorry, Oakley is gone." That same day, police arrested him on 3 counts of aggravated assault involving circumstances that endangered life, plus 1 count of endangering the welfare of a child. Examiners found a string of older injuries on Oakley's body, which Prescott tried to explain away. A toy blaster, a fall from his tricycle, a tumble off a chair. None of those explanations came close to accounting for the severity of what investigators actually found: deep bruising, blunt force trauma, and signs of internal bleeding. Prescott was arraigned that same day, showing up to court still in a hospital gown, visibly on edge, talking quietly to himself. District Judge Rich Luther addressed him directly. Prescott cut him off and refused to cooperate. District Attorney Stephanie Vettenberg Schaffer asked the court to set bail between $800,000 and $1 million. Prescott spoke up from the courtroom floor. "This time I'm going to prove I'm innocent. They lied. Yes, I've got a long record, but I've always answered for it. I'm asking for a low bail." Judge Luther's response was blunt. "These are serious charges. I'll be generous. I'm setting bail at $1 million, though frankly I think it should be higher." Even after the hearing closed, Prescott kept peppering people with questions. He was told to apply for a public defender. That same day, Oakley's uncle Dylan Blackman launched a GoFundMe to cover funeral costs, with a modest goal of $8,000. More than $2,000 came in within the first day alone. The fundraiser has since been closed. The investigation was led by Detective Mark Duker and Bradford Police Chief Michael Ward. Forensic findings confirmed that Oakley had been sexually abused. Details I won't get into here. And DNA evidence collected during the examination matched Prescott. Investigators determined that the injuries were inflicted during the stretch of time Oakley was in his father's care, with most of the worst trauma occurring in the hours shortly before he died. According to public reporting, the injuries were documented as having happened sometime between July 17th and the day of his death, August 14th. Forensic pathologist Dr. Todd Lukasevich testified that what happened to Oakley could only be described as torture. and concluded that the boy likely remained alive for at least 4 hours after sustaining his fatal injuries. As the investigation progressed and more evidence came to light, prosecutors kept adding charges, ultimately including criminal homicide, rape of a child, rape resulting in serious bodily injury, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse with a child with a separate count for serious bodily injury, aggravated indecent assault of a child, indecent assault of a person under 13, and incest involving a complainant under 13 on top of the aggravated assault and endangerment counts. Under Pennsylvania law, anyone charged with first-degree murder is automatically denied bail, and Prescott, who had initially been held on the $1 million figure, lost any possibility of release once the homicide charge was filed. Rumors started circulating online almost immediately after the story broke, spreading through social media among residents of McKean County. One persistent claim held that the 2021 charges against Prescott had been dropped entirely. Prosecutors clarified that this wasn't accurate. A 2021 jury had in fact acquitted him on 3 aggravated assault counts, but convicted him on the charges tied to endangering a child's welfare. A few days after Oakley's death, 2 women independently started petitions on a civic advocacy platform. The first, posted August 18th by Amanda Phillips, called for greater public awareness of this kind of crime, more funding for child protective services, and accountability for everyone connected to the case. A second petition, launched 2 days later by Jacqueline Verbowski, proposed a new law named in Oakley's memory, a federal registry for people convicted of serious crimes against children, with mandatory monitoring after release. She called it Oakley's Law. A Pennsylvania state representative took up the cause of turning that idea into actual legislation. Martin Causa, who represents the Turtle Point area in the State House, pledged to introduce a bill aimed at closing the exact loophole that let Oakley's story happen. The fact that once Prescott finished his maximum sentence for endangering a child, he walked free with 0 supervision and, as Causa put it, the opportunity to re-offend. In October 2025, Causa released a co-sponsorship memo for House Bill 2075, which would amend Title 61, the section of Pennsylvania law governing the prison system and parole boards, to require that anyone convicted of an offence against a victim under 18 remain under supervision for a set period after release, regardless of whether they served their full sentence. In January 2026, Tasha shared her first public statement since her son's death, a farewell letter. In it, she wrote that most people never got the chance to know Oakley, so she wanted to tell them who he really was. A boy who never played by the rules, pure, joyful chaos in human form, so happy that he'd laugh even when he was being scolded. She described him as full of light and love, too pure for this world, the best hugger and kisser in the family, someone who'd wake you up in the morning just by patting your cheek. She said he was sweet and stubborn in equal measure. He loved shoes, but only mismatched pairs, and would refuse to wear anything that matched. Meanwhile, he had no problem raiding the grown-ups' closets, parading around the house in adult shoes before hiding them somewhere. During pool days, he'd drag the inflatable rings from one end of the yard to the other, and the second he was done, he'd start all over again somewhere new. Not because he disliked swimming, she said, but because he liked doing things entirely his own way. He loved dancing, bobbing his head, jumping around to music and singing along, even though full sentences were still beyond him, so it usually came out as one long, happy note. He developed a sweet tooth before he even had the teeth to go with it, and Tasha wrote that she liked to imagine him in heaven now, working his way through an endless supply of cake, popsicles, and yogurt. She also mentioned the necklace, a black cord with a silver bead in the middle, that had gone missing by the time they were able to collect his belongings, and asked that if anyone had seen it, they return it so his brother could have it back. Her last memory of him, she wrote, was a day the kids were painting flower pots, and Oakley poured paint straight onto the family dog, who then tracked it through the entire house. Blue paint on the first floor, red on the second. While Oakley laughed through the better part of an hour, it took everyone to clean it up. She said they're still finding red paint in random corners of the house to this day, and that she'd give anything to have that mess back, to have that joyful chaos back. She closed by insisting that Oakley's life wasn't a tragedy, that it couldn't be reduced to the story of how it ended, and that she wanted people to remember his smile first, to remember the mark he left behind as one of laughter, innocence and gentle chaos, not a weapon for hatred, but something that could be turned toward good. He was more than a headline, she wrote. He was a little boy who loved trucks and trick-or-treating, who loved his family and puppies. He was Oakley Cabey Headland. The next day, Tasha posted a photo of herself with her surviving children, writing that they would always be her babies, that they missed Oakley every single day, that he'd be remembered forever as her guiding star, and that she couldn't wait to see him again someday. The preliminary hearing took place on October 7, 2025, running roughly 5 hours in a packed McKean County courtroom in Smethport, with police officers and forensic experts among those called to testify. Forensic nurse Cheryl Weir told the court that nearly every part of Oakley's body showed signs of trauma, and walked the court through the recognised markers used to identify sexual abuse in a case like this, noting that Prescott's case checked off nearly all of them. Oakley's family sat through the hearing, and Tasha wept more than anyone, especially as crime scene photos were shown. She had to step out of the courtroom multiple times to compose herself. Judge Luther ruled that prosecutors had presented enough evidence to send the case to trial. The district attorney's office is now pursuing the death penalty against Prescott, the harshest sentence available under state law, with life in prison without parole as the only alternative if a death sentence isn't handed down. Pennsylvania hasn't executed anyone since serial killer Gary Heidnik in 1999. Former Governor Tom Wolf imposed a moratorium on executions back in February 2015, officially halting every scheduled death warrant in the state, and his successor, current Governor Josh Shapiro, has continued that practice, never having signed an execution warrant himself. More than 180 people were on death row in Pennsylvania at the time Wolf's moratorium took effect. Wolf argued the system was too costly, too error-prone, and too inconsistently applied to keep using without reform first. Realistically, even if Prescott is eventually sentenced to death, he would likely spend decades on death row before anything changed, just as so many others have. But functionally, a death sentence and life without parole mean roughly the same thing here. If convicted, Prescott will die in prison. The case has already been delayed multiple times. His original attorney, Chris Pence, withdrew from the case in December 2025 after Prescott accused him of colluding with prosecutors. He was replaced by attorneys Andrew Capone and William Meal. 2 judges have since recused themselves over conflicts of interest, and by late April 2026, senior judge Norman Krummenacher had been assigned to preside over the trial. As of the most recent reporting, no significant new developments have surfaced. Because Tyler Prescott has not yet stood trial, he remains legally presumed innocent unless and until a court finds otherwise.